Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt.
Hello,
Welcome,
Teresa.
Father. We are in show number 20.
20.
20. Well, I was looking ahead because I was thinking there were like 40 shows, but actually there really aren't, I don't think, are there?
I think before we finish, we will have about 40 to 43, 45, something like
good.
that. I still have a couple more to work on toward the end.
Good. Then I'm not to halfway yet. I like that. I like that. This is such a pleasure for me to be here every week and to do these shows as it is. I know from our listening audience because they always share with me, and hopefully they do with you as well.
They do, yeah.
The how much everyone really enjoys these programs.
This is great fun. I love doing this. I love being able to talk about the history of the church, uncover little stories and put things into perspective. You know, so often we have this rather strange notion of the Catholic Church, and sometimes, unfortunately, you see this on television programs like the History Channel. Sometimes the History Channel has some really good stuff, but otherwise, sometimes it's really weird stuff, you know. And most people can distinguish between something good and something they do on Roswell or, you know, Area 59 or whatever. But in between those, sometimes there's and the only way you're going to be able to tell the good stuff from the bad is by having good, solid history. And we have some wonderful historians that have done some great work. I keep on constantly referring to Warren Carroll.
Absolutely.
And there are just a number of others that are, really great. And it doesn't mean you have to sit down and read, 75 books in order to do this. All you have to do is listen to these programs.
That's it. Wonderful. Absolutely. And as a historian, I hate to say it to you, but, history was never one of my very favorite subjects, but boy, since you've been coming around, Father, it is. It really is. I enjoy it so much.
I just find it to be so much, reality is so much more interesting than fiction.
Oh, boy, that's for sure. But it can be presented in ways that are much more interesting than others, and you do an excellent job of that.
Thank you.
I think we left off last week, Father, just where we had gotten Pope Nicholas on the throne of the papacy through a little confusion. I think we were going to go back and address that maybe a little bit before we...
We are.
Okay.
This is Pope Nicholas II.
Right.
He is a great reforming pope. He was the Bishop of Florence, not an Italian himself. He's actually from Burgundy. But he is elected through the efforts of the Normans. They're able to run again some of these Roman families who are trying to usurp control of the chair of Peter. They're run out, and so he's able to come in. And what he does is he tries to once and for all make it clear as to how popes are elected, and he does this through the election decree of 1059. And this one decree in itself, more than anything else, helps to solidify the understanding of the office of Pope as being a universal office within the Church itself. The Bishop of Rome is, of course, the successor of St. Peter. We've always seen that. But now, with the way in which he's elected, it's going to become all the more clear that he is represented, that he represents the entire universal church. We can look at the conclave of 2005 and see that. When you see all those cardinals from all over the world coming in, you just recognize the universal nature of this office. And so the Pope has always had that role of serving the whole church as the unifying factor of the whole church. But now his own election is going to enhance that all the more. Also keep in mind that, when you think about it, look at the last series of popes that we've been talking about, and they're coming from all over the place. Pope Nicholas is from Burgundy. It's in southern France. Pope Stephen, Frederick of Liège, was from Lorraine, which is in eastern France. Or if you're German, you'd say that was actually in westernmost. Vicar II, he was from Germany. Leo the Ninth was from Alsace, although a German himself. Damasus II was German. Clement II was German. And so one after, and then you have to go all the way back to Gregory VI to have a Roman. Oh. And if you remember, that was that very unfortunate situation concerning his disposal because of some accusations of simony and all. But you have to go all the way back to 1046. That's 15 years, 6 popes since there was a Roman. So truly you can see that this office is universal, the entire church. We've gotten used to having Italians as popes,
right?
Certainly since the 1500s. Hadrian was the last. He was a Dutchman, and he only lived for a couple of years as pope. But all Italians, all the way up until Karol Wojtyła, Polish, and now presently Ratzinger, German. Again, our first German pope since Leo the Ninth.
Wow.
So, and a lot of this has to do then with that election decree of 1059. Now, I'm going to take just a couple minutes and talk about that, and then we'll move on from there.
Okay.
Because it is challenged. It's going to be challenged, again, by the anti-reform movements, and also by an emperor. And we'll see that in a couple of minutes. But in the decree itself, they basically said, Pope Nicholas said, there will be 7 cardinal bishops. These are, they're all going to be cardinals. The electors will be called cardinals. Now, that's an old term. It's been around for many, many centuries. It goes back to at least the last part of the 1st century A.D., that concept of the cardinal. But now it takes on another role as being the electoral college of the next pope. And so there are going to be 7 cardinal bishops. The number 1 cardinal bishop, the president of the College of Cardinals, is going to be the Bishop of Ostia. Okay. And then along with him will be the bishops of cardinal archbishops, cardinal bishops of Porto, Albano, Silva Candidi, Palestrina, Sabina, and Tusculum. These are all cities, towns, regions around Rome itself. Okay? And they're all going to have bishops, and these bishops will be the convening bishops that will call together the conclave. The term itself, con, with, and clavis, the keys. So they'll have the keys to pass on to the next successor of St. Peter. And ultimately, as they gather together, the selection of the next pope is going to be made by these 7 cardinal bishops, along with another designated 28 cardinal priests and another 18 cardinal deacons. Now, over the centuries, over 950 years, or almost 950 years, there have been constant tweakings of these. Obviously, there are many, many more cardinals than these today, and a constant change in the College of Cardinals itself. But this is the basic structure that is with us even to today.
It was my first introduction to the different, not categories, I don't know, whatever separations of cardinals with the last election. I didn't know that existed before.
Right. And you know, when you think about it, too, Pope John Paul II was Pope for so many years that basically those of us who remember his election were pretty young at that point.
Yeah, right.
You know, so a lot of us had forgotten about all of those intricacies, even over all those years.
It was very interesting.
Yeah. Now, what happens is that, according to the decree of 1059, these individuals will actually elect the next pope. Then, that selection, that new election, will be then presented to the people and the clergy of Rome. So, unlike the decree going all the way back to Lothar, in which he had decreed that the Roman clergy would elect the Pope, now you have this discrete group of cardinals from all over the place. They're, as you can see here, they're mainly Italian and Roman. But there's no reason why you can't have cardinals from other parts of the world, which is exactly what happens. And they're going to elect. Then they're going to present the new pope to the people and to the clergy. Do you remember last April, when Joseph Ratzinger was presented to the people, and then he had this huge applause in the piazza. That was in the mind of Nicholas II. That's what's supposed to happen. Yeah, and then what happens is that word is then sent, according to the decree. The word is then sent to the emperor to let him know that this election has taken place. In no case, in either of these, either the people and the priest on the one hand or the emperor on the other, is there a veto power. No. Now, that's going to sneak its way in much later on, but at the time, the idea of the decree, there is no veto power. These cardinals have the absolute authority to elect the next pope. Well, what happens is that Nicholas, as I said before, is able to do what he does and pull through this decree because he's got the backing of the Normans. And those are all politics is local. Those are the local power brokers at that point.
Right.
The emperor is of no use to him. He's just a little boy, Henry, and so what happens then is that Nicholas then begins carrying forward the reforms of his predecessors, particularly St. Leo. And he especially goes after simony, continuing to attack simony. He's able to do this in Italy because, as I say, he's supported by the Normans. But when he gets north of the Alps, he finds more and more bishops who are backsliding and being beholding to the imperial court. And the imperial court is not necessarily all it had been in the previous generation. Agnes finds herself outmaneuvered. Henry III is dead, and Henry IV is just a little boy. He's very impressionable, as we're going to see in a couple minutes. But many of the bishops in Germany now regret having rolled over for Pope Leo, and they see Pope Nicholas as somebody that they can simply ignore. And so there are difficulties. In fact, it becomes so acrimonious that at one point up in Germany, there are bishops who have ordered their priests not to mention the name of the Pope in the intercessions at Mass. That's pretty extreme.
Yes. Wow.
Well, we're going to see that this is going to lead to some really tough times, especially for the next pope to come along, and the confrontation he has. It is not a pretty moment at all. But so you see that there is the forces of anti-Reformation taking place in areas, particularly in Germany, but also in parts of Italy. Up in northern Italy, one of the big centers for anti-reform is the city of Milan. The Bishop of Milan is a real backslider, and he resents the decrees against simony and also concubinage. Many of his priests are just flaunting the fact that they have women in their rectories are married, and they just do that. And he doesn't enforce celibacy at all. There is in Milan a lot of people who are very upset about this. There's a whole group that are strong supporters, and they're mainly lay people, very strong supporters of the reform within the church, and they recognize this is the way that it needs to go. In particular, there is a deacon in Milan. His name is Ariald, and Deacon Ariald pulls together a lot of the laity and tries to to force a reform within the diocese itself. He has studied canon law, and he is also a man who has a vision of a church that is a holy church being led by holy priests and bishops. And a kind of unique idea, you know. And in 1056, in the middle of all the other stuff that's going on with Nicholas now leaving Florence, coming down, becoming Pope down there, being supported by the Normans, running out the anti-reform people in Rome, he wants to do the same thing in Milan, up in northern Italy, and he gathers together these lay people. Now they're known in history as the Paterini, which it can be translated a couple different ways. It means the little people. Sometimes it's used in another way. Sometimes it's referred to as the rag pickers, but these are not. These are middle class people. These are the burghers, okay, the business people of Milan, and there are confrontations between the Patronini and on the one hand, and the forces of the Archbishop of Milan, a man by the name of Archbishop Guido, and Guido is an anti-reformer. And it actually turns violent. There are violent confrontations between the two groups. And so Nicholas then hears about these things, and he sends a delegation of two people up to Milan to meet with the two groups and to try to bring about some peace between the two. And one of those is Peter Damian, St. Peter Damian. And when they get to Milan, they meet with the Patronini, and they meet with the Archbishop, they meet with the clergy, and they quell the riots, they quiet the crowds, and quite honestly, there's a certain amount of demagoguery going on among the reformers. You know, some of these guys are, they're demagogues, and they're whipping up the crowds, and so St. Peter and the other delegate, who I'll talk about in a couple minutes, are able to diffuse the crowd and calm the demagogues. And then they go to the Archbishop and they go to the clergy, and they get oaths from both groups, from the Archbishop and from his clergy, that they will clean up their lives and that they will reform themselves, both in the area of simony and in the area of concubinage. And then they leave.
Oh, okay.
And nothing happens. Unfortunately, Nicholas dies also. And so Nicholas II dies. His body is brought back to Florence, where he asked to be buried, his beloved Florence. Now, what happens is up north, they hear about the death of the Pope. And within the imperial family, around the imperial family, there are certain noble families that decide that they're going to take action themselves. And so up in Aachen, they gather together and they put forth a nominee for Pope. And he's an anti-reformer. And the whole idea is to turn back all the reform that's been done now for the last generation. On the other hand, you have very few reformers left, and Hildebrand is one of those. And Hildebrand rushes to Rome when he hears that Nicholas has died, and moves toward a conclave to be able to elect a new pope. And they do this. They elect Bishop Anselm of Lucca, who takes the title Alexander II. Okay. And so he's going to be part of the reform. He himself, as a bishop, had been a supporter of the Paterini. He had been a student at a reform monastery in Normandy. And so this is a man who is standing within that realm of reform. Regardless, even with his election according to the decree of the conclave.
An election by the cardinals for the first time.
Clear. This is very, and this is actually the first time this has been done. Alexander II is legitimately elected. He's a reformed pope. The people. He's presented to the people of Rome. The people of Rome proclaim him. The priests of Rome proclaim him. Word is then sent north to the emperor that there's been election of a pope, and here he is. However, up in Aachen, they have already brought together they formed their own conclave, and they elected a priest and who took the title Honorius II. And now things get really ugly. The whole group goes down to Basel in Switzerland, where some of these are German bishops, some of them are northern Italian bishops, Lombard bishops, and they all gather together to stage this installation of this anti-pope. And this is what they do. They take the King of Germany. He's 11 years old, Henry IV, 11-year-old boy, and they tell him that he should invest the Pope. He will create the Pope, because emperors can create popes. And so they give him a mitre. This little 11-year-old boy comes forward and places it on the Honorius II's head, and now this anti-pope is installed by the emperor. His mother is livid. Agnes is so angry at what has been done, and these are German bishops that are doing this, you know, and she is so angry that she literally leaves the court and goes to a monastery. She goes to a convent and simply abandons the world.
Oh my gosh!
But in doing that, she also abandons
her 11-year-old son.
Yes, that's right. And these advisors are absolutely unscrupulous in using this boy and in putting into his mind the idea that he has authority over everything, including the making and unmaking of popes.
Not good.
Alexander II has a very different concept. You know, Pope Alexander II argues instead that no human can judge a pope, only Christ himself. Well, that stands in a long tradition. We've gone back, over many, many centuries, and we've seen the same thing. Going all the way back to Alcuin of York, remember when he tells Charlemagne, right at the beginning of our course here, he tells Charlemagne, you cannot judge Pope Leo III. You don't have authority to do that. And then remember, ultimately, at Christmas time of 800, Pope Leo is able to figure out how to get out of this conundrum.
Right.
Well, ever since then, you had the same thing. You had that one moment at Sutri when Henry III and Gregory VI meet, and ultimately in that private meeting, and again, it's the Pope who solves this by abdicating. So you don't have an emperor. We've never had an emperor that has claimed the authority that little Henry IV now is claiming. And instead, Alexander II is trying to correct him, saying, no, the popes are governed. We are subject to the laws of the church and to the Gospels, but to no one else, and certainly not to you, little boy. Finally, there is a voice of reason up in Germany. It's the Bishop of Cologne. His name is Anno. And Bishop Anno becomes regent for the king, and he's able to steer the German church by subtle diplomacy back to obedience to Alexander. And so this Honorius II goes back to whatever he was doing before.
Great. Okay.
And but this little breach has caused a permanent warping within Henry's mind. And as he gets older, he's still going to be under that impression.
Okay.
The reform continues, this continues all the way up until there's an Easter Synod in 1073. However, as we look around, we see most of the reformers have died off by now. The kitchen cabinet is, this is the next generation, and so you have, for instance, Adalbert of Bremen, who was one of the great German voices of reform. He had died already in March. Earlier, Cardinal Humbert had died in 1061. Peter Damian himself dies in 1072. And in April of 1073, Alexander II dies. If you look around, if you've been keeping a scorecard, Hildebrand is the last one standing. Everyone else has gone on to their reward. And when the funeral of Alexander II takes place in Rome, it sort of reminds you of John Paul II's funeral of 2005. It's this huge gathering, and then unfortunately the press gets involved in this, and of course they can't even bury this great man before they're already speculating about his successor. Well, actually the same thing was actually happening at the funeral of Alexander II. People were already thinking about who the successor was going to be. Alexander II was really a great reforming pope. He was one who persuaded William of Normandy when he invaded England in 1066. It's Alexander who persuades him to bring the reforms to the church in England, because England had been a backslider in all of that. Also, when the Normans had taken Sicily, it's actually Alexander II. Leo IX was not successful in this, but Alexander II is going to be successful in persuading the Normans to turn over those churches and monasteries back to the church again. So he's going to be very successful in this. He's going to be a great encourager of the Reconquista that's taking place in Spain, and that as the Reconquista takes place, little by little, that the Catholic forces again are triumphant in the Iberian Peninsula, that as they come back in with clerical reform. Simony and concubinage would be done away with. He is, as a supporter of the Paterini, as I'd mentioned before, and also Matilda of Tuscany is going to be a great supporter of the papacy. He'll be working very closely with them too. So his funeral is a time of great appreciation. I mean, obviously he didn't serve nearly as long as John Paul II, but there is that same affection that people are going to have for him. In the middle of the funeral itself, which takes place in April of 1073, the middle of the funeral itself, somebody in the crowd shouts out when they see the Archduke Hildebrand of Suena in the entourage. They shout out, "Hildebrand, Hildebrand, Hildebrand," and it caught on. And people began shouting. Again, you can't even bury this pope. And all of a sudden, the funeral is like usurped by this crowd that rushes forward, grabs Hildebrand, lifts him up, and proclaims him the next pope.
Oh.
And Hildebrand is shouting, "No,
I can't do that.
You can't do that. That's wrong." Well, they carried him kicking and screaming all the way to St. Peter's. And when they finally, the funeral took place at St. John Lateran. And finally...
Oh, my gosh.
Oh, yeah. And finally, by the time they got to St. Peter's and put the guy down, he turns around, tears in his eyes, and says, "No, we can't do this." And the people are saying, "You're not leaving. You're going to be Pope." And he says, "Okay, get the cardinals in here." And so what they did was they held now the second conclave in history. He insisted on following the election decree of 1059. Well, good for him. The cardinals were assembled. Order was restored. He was then clearly elected unanimously.
He better
Well,
be.
he better be. Yeah, all right. But he was unanimously elected. One of the cardinals went out to the people and acclaimed him. Well, they went crazy, as you can well imagine. And then a letter was sent off to the emperor informing him of the election of of taking the title Gregory VII.
Okay.
Now, Hildebrand took that title, and it is so full of meaning. You remember that he was loyal to the dying breath of Gregory VI.
Right.
And so by taking that title, Gregory VII, he honors the memory of that great saint who had done so much, not saint, but that great pope who had done so much to reform the church, to begin the reformation of that church, and was so ill-treated by Emperor Henry III at the end of his life.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some things about this man. He is a Tuscan. So we have an Italian for Pope. He's from the little village of Siena, but he spent most of his youth in Rome, believed to be a student of Father John Gratian, who of course becomes Gregory VI. He is elected Pope in his 50th year. He's 50 years old when he is elected Pope, and he was, of course, heavily influenced by Gregory VI. He was there at the time of his death. He had then gone on to Cluny to become a monk. He was then called out of Cluny to come back to work with Pope Leo IX. He was made a subdeacon at that point, eventually archdeacon. He is never ordained a priest. Well, he will be, of course, after being elected Pope. But he is one of those who considered himself unworthy to even be a priest, and yet worked for the church so much as a legate for Leo. It is he who goes to Tours to debate with and finally bring to a recognition of heresy one of the theologians at the day, Berengar of Tours. And Berengar of Tours is one of those few, I mean, there are not many heretics in the Western Church in the Middle Ages, but he's one of those who refuses to accept the real presence of the Eucharist, and has some rather novel ideas on that. Ultimately, his heresy is exposed, his heresy is condemned, and Hildebrand is very careful to condemn the heresy but not the heretic, and he'll actually protect Berengar from physical harm in that, and it's a beautiful moment. He works for Victor II, travels throughout the Western Church, again preaching against simony and concubinage, doing what he can to reform the church and all of that. One of those that he travels with is none other than St. Hugh of Cluny. And again, preaching along with St. Hugh, trying to reform the church wherever he possibly could. I'd mentioned that there were two delegates who had been sent up to Milan. One of those was Peter Damian. The other was Hildebrand, representing the Pope to the Paternini. He is also one of those who goes down for Alexander, down to southern Italy, and negotiates with the Normans to bring them back into allowing the churches to be controlled by the church rather than by themselves. So this is a guy who's had a lot of experience.
He has indeed.
Yeah.
And
of course, as I say,
very influential experience throughout this.
Oh. He's the right hand of Pope after Pope after Pope.
Right.
And so in 1059, when he returns to Rome, and for the funeral of Alexander II, he is the Archdeacon of Rome, the leading figure in the Curia, great supporter of Alexander II, also a great critic. He always told Alexander, "You're too timid. You need to get out there and be more forceful." And now that he's elected, he has that opportunity to do just that, to be more forceful. He's an interesting man to look at. If you look at his letters and at his sermons and at what little writings he actually did, here is an individual who knew the New Testament and Old Testament backwards and forwards. He could quote you chapter and verse of the New Testament, just absolutely incredible that way. He also quotes in his letters occasionally some of the decretals and some of the writings and sermons of Pope Gregory the Great. Okay. Interestingly enough, in all of his sermons and writings and letters, he very seldom cites the church fathers. And in fact, in all of his writings, there is only one reference to St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, St. John Chrysostom, and that's it.
Wow.
But so, in other words, his education is such that it's very, very biblical.
Oh, okay.
You know, it's heavily biblical, but at the same time, and a little bit of papal, but not a broad background that you might expect from somebody who has been so important to church history. Except for, let's keep in mind that ever since he was a relatively young man, he's been out working. He didn't have a chance to do much study except for the scriptures, which he memorized backwards and forwards. There's one other thing I should say about him before we get into his life. He has a fatal flaw, and that is he trusts people on their face value. If you tell him something, he will believe you. And that is going to be his undoing. Well, okay. You have him elected Pope. He calls a synod very, very quickly, and he is obviously a man of action, not of words. He has two targets, and one of those is simony, and the other one is concubinage. And very early on, he realizes that all the efforts of the reformers toward bringing about a clerical celibacy is not going to be successful simply because of the way you have clerical marriage. Now, go back and remember that all throughout church history, there had been many men who had been made bishops, ordained bishops, who were already married, right? And the understanding was, and it always has been, and we can go back and review the decrees of the various councils and synods, but it has always been the understanding that when a man is made a deacon or a priest or a bishop, that if he is married, he'll enter into a celibate relationship with his wife for the rest of her life. It's one of the reasons why she has a veto power. And from time to time, it's a dual role in which the husband and wife agree to become celibate, and in many cases, the wife then will leave the husband and go to the monastery, to a convent on her own, to live out the remainder of her life as a holy woman, as a holy nun. Especially if they're older and they've had a family that's already been raised. So anyway, but the fact of the matter is that if that doesn't happen, it's not an easy thing for a man and a woman to vow celibacy, and yet having been shared the marital bed all these years, now all of a sudden to give that up.
Right.
And he realizes this, and so what he does then instead is that he begins to restrict the ordination of married men. Now, there are historians who will argue that he is the creator of clerical celibacy. And that, in fact, was a myth that was commonly believed, and well, unfortunately, even today is commonly believed, but was certainly commonly believed into the 1970s and 1980s. Great, wonderful historical works, and maybe if I get a chance, I'll bring some of these in again and remind us again of some of the works that have been done in the last number of years, have gone back over the documents, looked at them more carefully, looked at the history, and instead we have a much different history and understanding. Gregory VII does not create clerical celibacy. What he does is he ratchets up the ordination requirements to make sure that celibacy is going to be able to be lived afterwards.
Right.
Okay. There are a lot of people who don't like this. And particularly there are a bunch of Germans that don't like this. And they themselves gathered together in 1074, and they, when he came to them and asked them to come to this synod of 1075. Many of them refused to come. They refused to come. And he's a man of action. Gregory played hardball with them, and he said, "You come or I'll excommunicate you." And many of them were excommunicated. So then he sends word to Germany, to the faithful, that they should not attend Mass of these excommunicated priests and bishops. One bishop in particular led the charge against Pope Gregory VII, and his name is Bishop Herman. No relation, of course, to our own. This is Bishop Herman of Bamberg, and ultimately he is one who will be excommunicated and removed, and ultimately he'll be successful. Pope Gregory VII will be successful at removing this great foe. He then orders a German synod to take place in Mainz, in which he's going to mandate the reforms in Germany, which had been not universally done. Accepted. And so now the key in all of this is going to be Henry IV. Right?
Oh, okay.
The Emperor Henry IV. He's now 23 years old, and he is convinced of his authority over the Pope.
Oh no!
Now he realizes that this Bishop Herman of Bamberg had gone too far, and so he basically cuts him loose. But on the other hand, he is going to rally the other bishops around him to oppose Pope Gregory and the synod, which is called. He goes on the offensive, in fact, and he sends his chancellor, the Count Eberhard, to Italy. Now, this is a slap in the face, because Eberhard is one of those who has been excommunicated. And so he's going to send him as his representative to Italy, specifically to Milan. And in Milan, violence has broken out again, and the leader of the Paterini has been assassinated. Eberhard arrives on the scene shortly afterwards and then congratulates the anti-reform forces for the murder of this man.
Oh.
He then turns to the new Archbishop of Milan, and at the cathedral, he invests the new Archbishop. Eberhard, on the name of the Emperor Henry IV, invests the Archbishop.
Okay.
He's excommunicated.
I would say there can't be any authority to do this. Okay.
No, not at all. This is an absolute clash between this young emperor and this old reformer. Gregory VII sees this as exactly what it is. It's an absolute slap in the face. The Pope saw his authority as unchallengeable in all of Christendom. He is the vicar of Christ, the judge of all. He is the moral judge, not just the teacher. He is a moral judge, not a ruler. That's often misunderstood.
Right.
People have a tendency to misunderstand Gregory. If you read his words and understand his meaning, he is not trying to be some kind of a theocrat, but he is understanding his role as Pope. And he's the one who needs to be investing the Archbishop of Milan, not some excommunicated chancellor of some young emperor someplace. Now, he has one arrow in his quiver.
Gregory.
Gregory.
Okay.
And that's excommunication. And he could, if he needs to, excommunicate young Henry. And if he does that, this is why this is particularly important from a political point of view. That removes all obedience from all of the vassals. That's the breakdown of the feudal system, And so, if he were to excommunicate Henry, it would mean that all of Henry's followers now are free to disobey him, And Henry realizes that. And so there is a showdown that takes place between the two. There's an exchange of letters that is absolutely vitriolic between these two men, absolutely vitriolic. It's not just letters. There's actually an attempted assassination of Pope Gregory. Now, we don't know, there's not a paper trail to say that it was actually Henry that put this up, but nonetheless, on Christmas Eve, Pope Gregory was celebrating Mass at the Church of St. Mary Major when two individuals broke into the Mass. These are, the one is a nobleman who had been a convicted murderer. He'd been pardoned, but he on his horse. He rides into the church.
St. Mary Major. Into
St. Mary Major on the horse along with another man, horseback, swords drawn. It turns out that there are not many people attending this Mass because there's a terrible storm going on outside, and most people didn't come out that night. So Pope Gregory is there with only a handful of people. This man comes riding up right into the sanctuary and takes his sword and slashes at Pope Gregory's head, causing a facial wound. And with that, interesting, with that, the man who attacked the Pope falls off his horse and has a seizure. He's foaming at the mouth. The other, this other fellow that accompanied him, he jumps off his horse. He grabs the Pope. He rips at his vestments, and then takes him and literally kidnaps him. And the other man is able to eventually get back up, and he flees too. In the middle of this terrible storm that's going on, here you have these two guys kidnap the Pope. They're heading off. They take him off to one of these fortified houses in Rome, and before dawn, word gets all over the city of what happens, and a huge crowd broke into the house and freed Pope Gregory. Guess what he does?
He's alive.
Yeah. Guess what he does?
What?
He says, "Take me back to St. Mary Major."
Mass?
He went back and continued the Mass at the exact spot in which he had been interrupted.
Wow.
Now that's a mensch.
Yeah.
That's really something.
Wow.
So much for the attempted assassination. But Henry's not going to roll over on this. And what he does is he calls together the bishops of Germany. They meet at the consular of the Synod of Worms. And there, young Henry denounces Gregory as illegitimately elected, not as the Pope, and also says that he is an adulterer and he's having a relationship with Matilda of Tuscany. This is absolutely ridiculous. But you know, the German bishops, what are they going to do?
If they're going to kill him, they're not going to care what they say about him.
There were 26 bishops there, including the Archbishop of Mainz and the Archbishop of Trier. And they listened to this condemnation on the part of Gregory, and they then sign a condemnation of Gregory. Gregory, interestingly enough, that next spring will condemn and excommunicate Henry. And then interestingly enough, he excommunicates the bishops who had signed this decree, only those, however, who had not acted under duress. So in other words, if you were a bishop, and if you yourself feared for your own life in signing this, he did not hold that against you then. Mm-hmm. Now you have this excommunication. Now Henry's in a world of hurt, because many of the great barons of Germany are saying, "Hey, we're not following you.
I don't owe you anything anymore."
That's right. Yeah, and so Henry tries his own excommunication thing. He goes to Utrecht, to the city of Utrecht, gets a hold of the bishop there, Bishop William of Utrecht, and he gets him to excommunicate Pope Gregory. Okay? He does it in a sermon on Easter Sunday, and within a month he's dead.
Oh my gosh.
All the other bishops started looking around going, "Whoa, somebody's got some wampum here, and it's not the emperor." And so in this great confrontation between the two, what happens is ultimately the German nobles meet together without Henry, and they basically send a letter off to Henry saying, you reconcile to the Pope, or we're no longer going to obey you. You must be reconciled and the excommunication lifted, and we order you to do this. Henry IV then gathers his family up and begins moving down to the Alps with the intention of getting to the Pope before the Pope gets to him, because he's gotten word that Pope Gregory is on his way to Germany. Okay. Now winter sets in, and he gets as far as the castle of Canossa, and he's staying at Canossa when Henry is making his way down, and he's going into Switzerland. He crosses over Mount Blanc, one of the big passes there, and here's the emperor and his family and his entourage, and they get to a small Swiss village. And when they get there, they go to the inn, to stay for a couple of days. And who do they find there but a whole bunch of German bishops? And he goes, what are you doing here? And they go, we are, we're fasting and we're doing penance. Why are you doing that? Well, we just came from the Pope, and we reconciled with him, and he's lifted our excommunication, and, well, we're fasting and we're doing penance, and we suggest you do the same. And shaken, Henry then continues his way down, ultimately gets to Canossa. There's a big, again, we don't know what the actual history is at this point. There are those who will say that Gregory refused to allow the emperor in, that he had to kneel for 3 days in the snow, begging for forgiveness. But that's a pious legend. Historians don't know exactly what happened at Canossa, except that the emperor and the Pope did meet. They did reconcile. And here's the case where Gregory, the flaw, he trusts anybody who tells him. Henry swears that he'll be a good boy from now on, that he's learned the error of his ways. And Gregory lifts the bull of excommunication against him. And now Henry returns to Germany. And when he does, he crushes his opponents. Now that they're, again, in beholding to him. He continues investing bishops. And finally, in 1080, he is excommunicated again. But this time around, the Pope doesn't have the kind of clout that he had the first time around. People are afraid. Mm-hmm. They're afraid of Henry. And Henry sets up a rival Pope, again, another German, 20 years. You're going to have this rivalry. Germany is going to be in turmoil. He invades Italy. Gregory is defended only by the Normans. He loses Rome. He flees to Castel San Angelo, and the city is taken over by a German army until finally word comes that the Normans have raised a bigger army, and the Germans then flee, and so the Pope is freed by this Norman army. But now the people of Rome have turned against Gregory.
Oh,
the same group
who demanded his election.
Yeah. But they're looking around, they're seeing all this carnage, and they say, well, why is this happening to us? Well, they blame it on Gregory. They say, well, if you'd only compromise with the emperor, there's some things you can't compromise on, Mm-hmm. Anyway, the long and short of it was that he left Rome, a very sick man, went to Monte Cassino, stayed there for a short while, then went to Salerno, where he died in exile. His last words are very pessimistic. His last words are, I have loved justice and hated iniquity, and that is why I die in exile. In actuality, he did not die in vain.
No.
He lived an incredible life. His papacy changed the church by reforming it, by purifying the church, by especially in the area of clerical celibacy, mm-hmm. and then also in simony. He freed the church. and the other reformers also along with him. But Gregory VII did so much to free the church from feudalism and to restore the central authority of the throne of Peter. What happens following afterwards is going to be a very solid papacy in which everyone in Western Europe especially looks to the Pope in leadership. And we'll see this in any number of popes in the remainder of the 11th century, into the 12th century, into the 13th century.
All right. You always hate to see a wonderful pope who's done so much in his life in such a sad feeling or whatever. Well, that's disappointing. But you have to look back at all that he was able to accomplish.
Really, yeah.
What a gift his papacy really was.
It really was, yeah.
But, all right, Father, thank you. And where do we go next week?
Next week we are going into the Crusades.
The Crusades begin.
Yes. Wow. In a sense, we've kind of set ourselves up for this because we've been looking at the Byzantines. They no sooner have broken with the church in the West, and all of a sudden they're now being attacked by the Muslims in a very ugly way. And so the emperor turns to who does he turn to? The Pope. To Pope Urban II. And Pope Urban II then calls upon Christian knights throughout Western Europe to come to save the Byzantine Empire. But even more than that, forget the Byzantines, to restore the Holy Land. To Christians who had, for so many centuries, had been out of the control of Christians, but now most recently, Christians could not even make pilgrimages to the Holy Land. He wants to restore that. And so we'll be looking at the Crusades. The First Crusade is, I think, just really a great, great story. Unfortunately, the other Crusades that follow afterwards don't come up to the muster.
All right.
That's where we're going.
Okay. Well, thank you, Father. And shall we close with your prayer and your blessing?
Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. World without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.